Sorry. Give me a second. Duplicate. I can't get it to record on the extended. Okay. Today's lipids. So quick review that what makes carbohydrates is the ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 carbon to hydrogen and oxygen, as well as the fact that all the ones you've seen are ring-shaped, right? And so that helps you recognize them as well. That what makes proteins is that they are many amino acids in a row. And you know exactly what an amino acid looks like. So you could recognize a chain of them by the amino groups linked to the carboxyl groups. And that's proteins. So lipids are a little different. Lipids you recognize, and that's part of what makes them lipids is what makes this kind of a heavy drawing day. You're going to be drawing a lot, so I'm sorry for that, but it's good practice. What makes them lipids is long chains of carbons with a lot of hydrogens attached to it. Pain in the butt to draw. We are going to focus in, zoom in on fats, which fats you probably already know are kind of the ultimate energy storage for living things. It's how we deal with large quantities of energy. Is we package them up in this complicated chemical package called triglycerides. That's the other word for fats, is triglycerides. You may have heard that word if you've ever had blood work done. If you had blood taken and you got numbers back that you got to see. Triglycerides are one of those numbers they give you. More when you're my age than yours. Because it turns out to be kind of bad to have a bunch of fat floating around in your blood. That's what triglycerides are. It's a more descriptive term for fats. In order to make a fat, and here comes the drawing part, it takes, well, any lipid really is constructed, the tails come from the fact that they're made of one or more fatty acids. And in the case of a fat, there's 3 fatty acids on a backbone of another molecule. Now the acid part tells you what? The fact that it's a fatty acid, just like it was an amino acid. What do they have in common? This was a question on your model worksheet. Nevada? Carboxyl. Good. And honestly, a fatty acid is just a carboxyl with a big honking chain of carbons hanging off. Yep. That one happens to be called octanoic acid because it's got 8 carbons beyond the carboxyl. There are lots of different fatty acids, all different lengths, and some of them have double bonds in between their carbons. And that changes their properties. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's a very kind of straightforward version of a fatty acid. Yeah?
Are we going to have to memorize that?
No, I told you, only amino acids you have to memorize. However, I could very well give you the fact that there are 3 of those. That's what the times 3 means. It takes 3 of those and one other molecule and make you bond them together for me into a triglyceride. So that's what we'll be doing in the notes today. So you can do it on your own. So what makes this a fatty acid is simply it's a carboxyl with a chain of carbons hanging off. Lots of different lengths of carbons are fatty acids. We just name them differently based on how many carbons long and whether there are double bonds. Questions so far? So take 3 of those and 1 glycerol The ending on glycerol maybe tells you something. We've seen that ending before, an -ol. What functional group might you be expecting to see? Allie? Good. Hydroxyl makes it an alcohol, and OL is the ending we use for alcohols. Glycerol happens to be a triol, which means it's got 3 hydroxyls. That's basically almost all there is to it. There's 3 carbons with a hydroxyl hanging off each one. So the trick is knowing how to put those 4 pieces together into an actual triglyceride. How are we going to do it, by the way? What's the process we're going to use to put them together? Ben? It's the only thing we're going to use this whole chapter. You know the drill. You just got to know which end of which thing to point at which end of the other thing, right? And so let me show you. Don't draw yet. This is the big one. You're going to draw the whole thing together. I'm going to show you the pieces separate, and then I'll show them together, and you can choose whether you want to draw them separate or together. Okay, so here's separate. Don't draw it. But what you can see now, and this is the part you have to kind of remember to not screw the molecule up, is we're pointing the hydroxyl end of the glycerol at the carboxyl ends of the fatty acids. Does that make sense? So you got OHs facing each other. So I'll probably on a test give you them oriented the wrong way. And you'll have to, in your brain, because that's a large part of knowing how to do organic chemistry, you got to kind of turn them around with your brain and go, nope, I got to point this part towards this point, because I need there to be an oxygen in between. Don't write that. You've already written that. So we're going to take, and it doesn't matter which side you take the O from, but you're only taking one O because it's, right? It's H2O. So can you see how the final molecule is going to look? It's going to be carbon, and then an oxygen in between, and then the carbon with the double bonded O, and then chain of carbons, right? Chain of carbons and hydrogens. So here's apart, here's together, with the 3 water molecules on the side. Apart, together. Make sense? I assume you want to draw it together. Am I right? Okay. Go for it. So that's fat. That's what fat looks like. Although, there are lots of different kinds of fats, right? You know that. You know that from food labels and commercials and stuff. How do we kind of divide fats down the middle? Now, saturated and unsaturated. Does anybody know what that means? I've tried to use the word saturated a couple of times. And the way I've used it is like when we talked about anes, right? It's a chain of carbons totally saturated with hydrogens. That's what saturated refers to. So what you're looking at and what you just drew is very much a saturated fat. It's got all the hydrogens it could possibly have because it has no double bonds in between the carbons. Now here's the thing, is if I put a double bond in between any of these carbons, let's see, like say here, if I got a double bond there, what's wrong now? What's wrong with those 2 carbons on either side of that double bond? Carbon can't have 5 bonds. It's only got 4 unpaired electrons. So what we have to do is get rid of 2 hydrogens. Now, who knows the difference between, now this is an unsaturated fat now. It's not done, but it's going to be an unsaturated fat. Who knows the difference between unsaturated fats? We say unsaturated fats are better for you, but there's one kind that's much better for you than the other kind. You've seen the labels that say no blank fats. What is it? Trans fats. This is so simple, it's funny. The difference between a trans and a cis, CIS is the opposite of trans. Fatty acid is this. If it's trans, you get rid of hydrogens that are on opposite sides of the double bond. And if it's cis, you do it on the same side. And it is literally as simple as that. So it'd be these two. Either way, cis or trans, what that is going to do, having a double bond there, is going to put a kink in the carbon chain. And so the more double bonds you've got in those carbon chains, the more kinks you're going to see. And so what happens is there's this not just chemical difference, but sort of property difference between saturated and unsaturated fats. So saturated are the ones with no double bonds. And so for a generalized shape of a saturated fat, let's draw just a very simple line drawing that shows that the chains, all three of the chains, are relatively straight. That means a glob of saturated fats can fit together with each other more tightly as those straight chains. And it's the reason that those molecules are solid at room temperature. Think of some fats you know that are solid at room temperature. They all tend to have one thing in common. Things like butter, bacon fat, once it cools in the pan, you've noticed it solidifies, right? Lard, which you probably haven't had much contact with. People used to cook with it all the time. The stuff on the edge of your steak, they're all solid. They also tend to all come from animals as opposed to plants. Plants tend to make, I don't know why, I'm sure there's a good reason, I don't know. They tend to make unsaturated fats. And unsaturated fats have those kinks we're talking about in the bonds. Makes them swirl around each other more, not packed together as tightly. It tends to make them liquid at room temperature. Nutritional science has generally designated unsaturated fats as better for you than saturated fats. That animal fats are more likely to have the stuff in them that clogs people's arteries and leads to heart disease, high blood pressure. And sure, that's true to an extent. By the way, name some plant fats. You've got them in your house, I promise. What are some plant fats? We just don't call them that. Mostly we call them oils. Name some oils you can cook with. Canola oil. Do you know about canola? What the real name of the seed it comes from is? Classic example of rebranding, where something has a terrible name and they rebrand it so they can sell it. That's the rapeseed oil is what it is. So yeah, canola is probably better. Olive oil. Yeah, peanut oil. They're all, what? Avocado oil, yeah. Yeah, they're all somewhat better for you, but they're all also still fats. Again, pound for pound, the highest calorie thing you can eat. And one thing we know for sure in nutritional science is that high calorie intake is like the worst thing. That's the biggest risk factor. Whatever you're eating, if you're eating a ton of it, if you're eating tons and tons of calories, that's bad for you. So they are still fats. That's why I said that. You know, you can eat French fries fried in peanut oil every day, and it's still really bad for you, even though those are unsaturated fats. So that's fats. That's the one you kind of got to know inside and out. Triglycerides, remember, is the more descriptive name for them. Phospholipids are another kind of lipids that I just want to kind of call out because it's going to show up again soon in chapter 7, which we'll be skipping to fairly soon. Chapter 7 is about cell parts. Phospholipids are a super important part of the cell membrane. Kind of part fat, part soap, weird molecule with some weird properties. That's the general shape of it, the general way we draw them. But so that head part looks like a head is a phosphate, and guess what the two tails are? It's a lipid, so what are the two tails? Fatty acids, right? Carboxyl plus a long chain of carbons. Any questions? That's the third of 3, really. We're not going to focus on nucleotides much. Anything unclear? So that part's done. We still have to talk about chemical reactions a little bit, but we're getting close. We're looking at a test on Friday. We're starting to be fairly confident it's going to be Friday and not Thursday. Okay, so your first test is Friday. I'll give you sample essay questions tomorrow. Today, I want to give you the last model worksheet. More like the amino acid worksheet than it is like the carb worksheet. You'll be glad to know. So you will need your molecular modeling kits. And I'll let you work for this.